welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this 14th Sunday after Pentecost, when our scripture reading is written in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and verses 6 through 9. Moses continued to say to the people of Israel, "So now, Israel, give heed to the statutes and ordinances that I am teaching you to observe, so that you may live to enter and occupy the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is giving you. You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God with which I am charging you. You must observe them diligently, for this will show your wisdom and discernment to the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and discerning people.' For what other great nation has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is whenever we call to him? And what other great nation has statutes and ordinances as just as this entire law that I am setting before you today? But take care and watch yourselves closely, so as neither to forget the things that your eyes have seen, nor to let them slip from your mind all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The book of Deuteronomy, the last book of Israel's Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Bible telling the national story from creation up to the point where they are about to enter the land of Canaan. This 5th book, Deuteronomy, is named the second law by the ancient compilers of the Bible. It's the second law in a sense because we've already seen in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers an account in the Torah of what it was that God commanded Moses on Mount Sinai to give to the people of Israel. And in Deuteronomy itself, Moses speaks as though at Mount Horeb or Sinai, God had only given the people the 10 commandments, while God had given all of the commandments to Moses. And now, therefore, Moses is offering them the second law, the second part, the second volume, if you will, of the lifestyle by which God expects Israel to live. So whether because we've seen it already earlier in the Torah, or because within Deuteronomy's own imagination, Israel has not seen this before, but it's a kind of second part, in either case, the emphasis beginning already with the name of the book is on this lifestyle legislation, this second standard of how to live as God's people. And it's interesting that that should be the naming of the book and the first thing that comes to mind, because indeed, it is not so much the laws or the legal mechanisms or the legal logic that strikes us as we read and hear Deuteronomy, but rather it is the focus on Israel's devotion, on Israel's response to God, on Israel's commitment to God who has been committed to Israel all along. And thus, the tone of Deuteronomy, and we hear it very much here in chapter 4, is a tone of teaching, a tone of urging, a tone, if you will, of preaching. That teaching and preaching urges Israel to be faithful to God and all that God asks, because God has been faithful to Israel. Here in chapter 4, there are a number of motivations that Moses gives for Israel's following this lifestyle, this standard of living that God offers. And the particular motivation that we see in these verses is actually a motivation of witness. The command is given to, the urging is given to follow these statutes and ordinances, and then all of the nations, seeing what Israel is doing, will say, what a wise and discerning nation this is, and realize that it is because Israel has a God who is different from other gods. Israel worships the God who is near when Israel prays. Israel worships a God whose urgings and whose calling and whose shaping of the people is unlike that of other gods in the nations around. And so one of the motivations that Moses offers for why Israel must follow this way of life that God is presenting is that it is a witness to other nations. And at the same time, at the end of the reading, it's also a witness to future generations of the people of Israel. You shall make them known to your children and your children's children. And then when Moses goes on after this reading, in a part that is not included, when Moses goes on with what the people shall make known to their children and grandchildren, it's not about God's demands, but it is about God's patience with an Israel that was stubborn, God's grace to an Israel that was wayward, God's mercy to an Israel that was disobedient. Moses recalls for them how God brought them out of Egypt in faithfulness, how God led them through the wilderness in faithfulness. The book of Deuteronomy is written at a time when the people will also recognize that God has brought them out of an exile in Babylon in faithfulness. It is God's faithfulness first, which they are urged to make known to their children and their children's children. And then, therefore, to live as God's people according to this pattern of life, this lifestyle, this standard of living that is laid out within the book. And if their children and children's children continue to live that way, the nations will continue to see God's people living as wise and discerning people. And that will be a witness to them of who God is, the one God, creator of heaven and earth, to whom everyone can turn for patience, for grace, for mercy, and for a way to live. God as the sole source of creation, of blessing, and of wise living. God bless.